Welcome to Talking Strategy. My name is Paul O'Neill, Director of Military Sciences at the Royal United Services Institute. Talking Strategy is a RUSI podcast series in which Professor Beatrice Husser and I talk to experts about strategy and the strategists that have helped shape our ideas about the world. Standing on the shoulders of these strategy giants, the series will provide an introduction to key thinkers from across the ages and across the world, in which we will be examining the influences on them and the impact they have had on us and our potential adversaries. So, allow me to hand over to my friend and colleague. Beatrice, welcome. The chair is yours.
Thank you very much. And I, in turn, am delighted today, very topically, to introduce my colleague, who is the John Knox Lawton Professor of Naval History at the King's College London, Department of War Studies, Andrew Lambert. Andrew Lambert and I have worked together for a very long time, and I've seen the blossoming of many of his books on maritime warfare, on naval warfare, including, of course, one about Sir John Knox Lawton, after whom his chair is called, but also Sir John Franklin's Search for the Northwest Passage, the Crimean War, very topically, pirates, Admiral Lord Nelson, Britain's God of War, sea powers, and many other titles. But now the most recent publication is on Julian Corbett, and it's called The British Way of War, Julian Corbett and the Battle for a National Strategy. Now, Sir Julian Corbett, who lived from 1854 to 1922, very helpfully introduced the concept of maritime strategy as a generic term which subsumes the narrower concept of naval strategy for the use of force at sea. And I cannot possibly refrain from actually giving you that very famous quotation from Corbett, where he said, "By maritime strategy, we mean the principles which govern a war in which the sea is a substantial factor. Naval strategy is but that part of it which determines the movements of the fleet when maritime strategy has determined what part the fleet must play in relation to the action of the land forces. It is almost impossible that war can be decided by naval action alone." So my question for you, Andrew, is name three most important ideas that Corbett contributed to strategic thinking against this background of talking about maritime strategy and contextualizing the Navy in this larger context of its interaction with land forces.
Thank you very much for that. It's a great pleasure to be here. Corbett's greatest contribution is to come from a very different place to the other great writers on strategy, not just of his period, but almost throughout history. He has no military experience. He is a lawyer, he's a novelist, he's a traveler, he's a liberal politician at local and national level, but he has no experience of serving in the military, and he comes to the military through history. He becomes a very serious historian in the 1890s, just at the time when the Navy is beginning to realize that history is going to be a reservoir of understanding that it will need as it goes forward, preparing for initially a war against France and Russia. But by the time he's at his peak as an influence on strategic thought in Britain, Imperial Germany. And it's Corbett's job to help the Navy work through that change from what would have been an essentially naval maritime war against France and Russia into a war where the Continental would be more significant against Germany, because Germany didn't offer any significant overseas extra-European targets. So putting pressure on Germany would be a European question. And Corbett's great contribution is to understand that Britain as a power has to weld its military forces and its naval forces together in order to achieve any effect at all. And that the experience of the last great war against the French Revolution and Napoleon was the best place to start thinking about how that would work in the future. So it's all about civilian control. This is going to be a statesman's war. It's going to be led by the men who make policy, not the men who make military decisions. It's not admirals and generals that run British strategy, it is statesmen. The heroes of Corbett's history books are William Pitt, Earl of Chatham, Lord Anson as a strategic political figure rather than as a fighting admiral, and the men who directed the great campaigns of Nelson, not just Nelson, but also the men who served in Whitehall. It's about the integration of those forms of war into a seamless whole, which maximizes the impact that Britain can have in a war against a continental hegemonic power like Napoleonic France, which massively outnumbers it in military power terms. And yet the British are going to triumph in this war because their primary weapon is one that Napoleon cannot counter. They've secured maritime dominance. They are able to impose economic war on their enemy in a form that is devastating. It's often forgotten, and Corbett didn't get round to mentioning this, but the most important war in the whole cycle of the French Revolution and Napoleonic conflict is a war between Britain and Russia between 1807 and 1811. It's a war with hardly any battles, very few human casualties, and yet the Russian economy was shattered. Russia abandoned the coalition with France and stood waiting for Napoleon to invade. 1812 comes after the British have destroyed the Russian economy. They would rather fight Napoleon than carry on fighting the British. Napoleon will only kill Russian soldiers. The British have killed the Russian economy, and that is decisive. And towards the end of his life, Corbett was coming to the realization that this is what happened in the Crimean War as well. Russia was not defeated militarily, it was defeated economically. So Corbett's understanding that international law had to be put in place to ensure that Britain was able to conduct an effective economic war against continental powers. This is why the single most important stipulations of the Congress of Vienna for the British were that there would be no mention of Britain's maritime belligerent rights policy. They also insisted on this in the treaty at the end of the War of 1812 with the United States. These issues were not even raised. This was the right arm of the British state, not the Navy, but what the Navy enabled the British state to do through its legal codes, through its courts of law. And they would do the same thing in the 20th century. The British use of intelligence and law courts in the First World War underpinned the blockade of Imperial Germany and the Central Powers. This is right at the heart of Corbett's thinking. And once we realize that he has a first-class law degree from Cambridge and is a qualified and practicing barrister, we begin to understand some of the subtleties of his thinking and the origin of his understanding of what British warfare looks like. He doesn't wear a blue jacket or a red jacket. He wears the wig of a barrister, and he thinks about war, policy, and politics through a legal prism rather than through a military or strategic prism. He understands as a lawyer that each case is different, and the exceptionalism of British strategy is something that he recovers from the work of some of his predecessors. Mostly, it has to be said, serving soldiers. Naval officers tended not to think much about strategy. They tended to leave that to the statesmen. Soldiers who had far less to do in the 19th century had ample time to think about strategy, and just a few of them realized that what the Germans were doing was not actually appropriate for the British. So Corbett's greatest contributions are, it's all about the law, it's about economics, and what the dominant continental military power of the age says is the answer is not appropriate to Britain. Britain is a maritime global economic power. It is not a continental military power, and it is never going to become one until 1916, when it mobilizes a mass conscript army for the first time in its history. It has avoided becoming a continental power deliberately, consciously, over and over and over again. When the soldiers ask for conscription, they don't get it until 1916. And it's a sign of the political weakness of the government that they're able to acquire it even then.
Can I come in there? So you have emphasized how Corbett focused on a continental military power as an adversary, but Britain should focus on that by means of economic warfare. And that in turn was a function of naval warfare and its lawfare, as one might call it today. Now, on the other hand, he does say on its own, or on their own, navies can only exhaust the enemy, but not actually decide a war. So very importantly, there's this other fantastic quotation from Corbett that we always hear: since men live upon the land and not upon the sea, great issues between nations at war have always been decided, except in the rarest cases, either by what your army can do against the enemy's territory and national life, or else by the fear of what the fleet makes it possible for your army to do. So you're not arguing in that case that the concentration by the United Kingdom on an expansionist continental power is the anomaly, but you argue in your book that it's the United Kingdom's army continental commitment in the 20th century that is the anomaly. It is not the focus on Europe that is the anomaly, but the deployment of a land force over a longer period of time. Because focusing on Europe and requiring the defeat of such an expansionist continental force on the European landmass is not inconsistent with Corbett's argument that that's where the decision will take place.
No, I think that's absolutely correct. What Corbett understands is that England, in its earlier books and later Britain, is not in a position to defeat the great continental hegemonic powers single-handed. It is going to have to work as part of a coalition. And the lesson of the great Napoleonic War phase is the inability of Britain to build those coalitions right down to 1812. The consistent failure of the continental powers to put aside their differences, mostly with each other, in order to face up to the overwhelming threat posed by Napoleon. And again, in the First World War, it is not Britain's job to defend France. That's France's job. Britain's job is to defend the one part of Northwest Europe that really matters to the English and later British state, which is the northern half of Belgium. The British have been in the northern half of what we now call Belgium, actively defending it against hegemonic powers since the 1580s. The Anglo-Spanish War starts when Queen Elizabeth occupies key strategic positions on the Scheldt estuary, the so-called cautionary towns. It's got nothing to do with piracy in the Caribbean. It's all about putting British troops into Dutch-Belgian fortresses. That's why the Spanish Armada can't use the Scheldt to launch an invasion of southern England. They're put there for a very particular purpose. It's no accident that when the Napoleonic Wars ends, where is the British Army? It's in Belgium. The whole of what we now call Belgium is occupied by British troops.
Can I interrupt there again? Because one of the things that you already mentioned is that Corbett started off as somebody who wrote novels, historical novels, and through his preoccupation, particularly with Drake and his successors, then became an historian and started with this study, particularly of the Anglo-Spanish War. What are the lessons that he drew in a concrete way from particularly the Anglo-Spanish War and of that period of history?
For the rest of his life, Drake was very much Corbett's number one hero. For him, Nelson was a later and slightly improved version, but Drake was the original. Just as the First World War breaks out, Corbett is involved in a major project to get a big statue of Drake in central London. Doesn't happen, but that's what he's doing. His early work on Drake, a very short biography, turns him from a lawyer and a novelist into a historian. He just picks up this whole idea about how historical research works. He absolutely enjoys the experience of working with evidence because that's his training. He then writes his first major book, Drake and the Tudor Navy, in which he attempts to do two things, which is to study the evolution of English naval power, but also the evolution of naval power itself, technically, tactically, and strategically. The book doesn't quite work. His book, which followed, called The Successors of Drake, dealing with the period after the death of Drake in 1593, is significantly better. And if somebody's going to read Corbett on the Elizabethans and the war with Spain, that's the book to read. The hero of that book is the Earl of Essex, who's a soldier. And he understands by that stage that it's the combined action of naval and military. In the earlier book, he's very much on the naval side. In the second book, he very much sees that it's the combined action of the two. And it's at that point that he transitions from being a historian who's writing about the past to being a historian who's teaching the past to the serving Navy. That's when he moves into professional military education as the lead historian for the Royal Navy's War Corps. The Earl of Essex, like Corbett, went to Trinity, Cambridge. Both of them were fascinated by the literature of war. Corbett and Essex read many of the same books. Corbett read Italian. He traveled to Italy a lot. He made some serious studies of 16th century warfare outside of this as well. So he's very much developing an understanding of how strategy is being built. His first essay is almost looking for naval strategy. It's about the integration of land and sea. And this is what Essex does. He starts from the land. He understands how to use the sea. And Essex is the man who brings the Anglo-Spanish naval war to an end by destroying the Spanish fleet at Cadiz in 1596. Drake burnt some ships. Essex captured the whole town and destroyed everything. And from that point on, the Spanish were never going to recover. So it's the combined action. And you see that same motif. The Navy lands the army, which destroys the naval base and gives the English, the British, greater command of the sea. And you see that over and over again. If you go to 1809, the great operation to capture Vlissingen in Holland and destroy the dockyard there, it's the decisive move of Britain's war against Napoleon. It releases the Home Defence Army for service in Spain. Nobody picks this up because, for political reasons, the campaign was always seen as a fiasco. It wasn't. It was a massive success. More than half the Home Defence Army departs from the United Kingdom, moves to Iberia, and Wellington's campaign moves from defending Lisbon to securing the whole of Portugal and beginning to move into Spain. So it's a shifting from being on the defensive, waiting for the French to invade, to being on the offensive and probing at France's limited control of Western Iberia. This is what Corbett is constantly doing. How do these two forms of power fit together? Who is making those big decisions? And he's finding the statesman-like decisions at the highest level. He's finding the integration of naval and military power. And he's tracking the way in which the British state does this. And in his great book about the 7 Years' War, he lays out a model of how British strategy works. The war is directed by a statesman, the Earl of Chatham. It's presided over in strategic terms by a great admiral, Lord Anson, and a great soldier, Lord Ligonier. And between them, these three men come up with an overarching plan and the strategic resources to defeat France and Spain in a series of campaigns that give Britain a greatly enhanced position in the world and leave both Spain and France defeated and humiliated.
So over and over, we see with Corbett this interface between the sea, use of the Navy, and land forces. And it's not just one or the other. And it's not just simply saying, like possibly Mahan can be interpreted to some extent, to say we should do it all at sea and the Navy alone can win battles. One of the interesting things about Corbett seems to be also that he is much more modest in his ambitions for what command of the sea could mean, namely that this cannot be simply a function of naval battles, and that he's got a much more nuanced idea there of how much one can achieve on the seas. Would you like to elaborate on that? Because that seems to me also to be a very important contribution, another very key idea that he's brought forward.
Corbett is working in the decade following the publication of Mahan's great book, The Influence of Sea Power Upon History. It's important to understand what Mahan is doing and where he's coming from. And the argument is that the US needs a navy because it's, A, depends on hemispheric security, which is best guaranteed at sea, and B, it's just become a complete nation, and it's about time the Americans expanded their reach beyond the continent, particularly into Asia, and that this would necessarily be a maritime project. So Mahan is selling the Navy to an American electorate, most of whom don't know where the sea is and don't want to pay for it. Corbett very much sees that Britain is a different kind of power. It is much closer to Europe, which is the source of all danger at this period, and therefore it has to be engaged in the continental sector. The British cannot afford to simply lay off from Europe and leave it to its own devices. They've had to do that on occasion, and it's not served them very well. They need to be engaged with Europe. They need to have this maritime strategy, which enables them to take a part in the European theatre and to limit the danger from that. The danger for Britain, of course, is an invasion by a dominant European power, and they've faced this time and time again. But that's not a serious risk. The British have invariably got a larger and more powerful fleet and are able to use that effectively. The idea that the French were going to invade in 1805 is completely nonsensical.
Could one add to that perhaps the question of what Corbett thought about blockades? Because blockades, other than invasion, are another means of doing something to Britain or Britain doing something to the continent. What was Corbett's view on that?
Corbett, like his great friend, Admiral Lord Fisher, understood that the British Isles were fundamentally vulnerable to maritime blockade. Britain depended from the 1780s on imported food. And this is a major strategic influence on the conduct of the Napoleonic conflict. The British spent 5 years dominating the Baltic to maintain access to Baltic grain supplies and Baltic shipbuilding stores. The largest fleet that the British have at sea between 1807 and 1812 is in the Baltic. It's not facing the French at all. That is the primary theatre. The flagship of that fleet is HMS Victory, which by no accident at all is deeply symbolic of British power. So for the British, avoiding being blockaded is absolutely axiomatic. They have to do this. And the experience of the First World War simply reminds them that the other side will always have a vote. In the long wars against France, there was always a serious threat to British maritime trade. In the 1690s, from a French battle fleet. In the Napoleonic era, mostly by cruisers and privateers. Even in the Anglo-American War of 1812, the activities of American privateers put a serious strain on British maritime traffic. So Corbett understands that the defense of maritime trade is critical. This is a primary task. That is not a primary task for the Navy of a continental military power. They do not do that. They don't think about it. And they're very distant from the commercial marine, whereas the Royal Navy has always been intimately engaged with it because it has to defend it in wartime, and it relies on it in wartime for auxiliary warships. And if the British Army is being deployed abroad, it will be travelling on British merchant vessels. Also, by Corbett's time, many of the officers and crew of the more prestigious commercial ships were members of the Royal Naval Reserve, and many of those ships would serve in particular as armed cruisers in the First World War. The German blockade was actually conducted by armed merchant ships, not by warships, because they had longer endurance and were more seaworthy. So blockade is the thing that would really finish off Britain. Invasion is not necessary. Fisher makes this point. He said it's invasion. That's something to alarm people, but it's a blockade that would really finish Britain. So cutting off Britain from its overseas commerce would destroy its economy. Cutting it off from food supplies would force it to surrender. So Britain's vulnerability is not invasion, it's something else. Invasion is used as a way of alarming people into putting more money into defense, but it's not the real threat.
Finally, I suppose, in your book, you contrast Corbett's views with battle-centric strategy, which you call a German import at the time, that went on to dominate strategic thinking in the Anglo-Saxon world for quite a while, and also, in fact, in France. And yet, this idea of the obsession with the battle comes not only from Jomini, but also from Clausewitz. And there you suddenly have somebody who very strongly influenced Corbett, and he himself imported the Prussians' ideas to a great extent. So how do you reconcile your accusation against this German import idea with the fact that Clausewitz was the great influencer of Corbett and his ideas?
There's a fundamental difference between Clausewitz and Jomini. They might be near contemporaries, but one of them is writing a how to do it manual, and the other one is writing a philosophy. And Clausewitz's philosophy is endlessly capable of development. And Corbett picks this up fairly quickly. His coadjutor on the Royal Navy's war course, 1904 through to 1907, Captain Edmund Slade, is a serious student of German strategic thought. He's very familiar with not just Clausewitz, but with all the more contemporary German writers. And both he and Corbett recognize that something has happened to German strategic writing. Clausewitz has laid out a way of understanding war, which can be interpreted to meet new circumstances. If you read Clausewitz, you'll find he mentions the sea twice, and very briefly. It's not important. If you live in Prussia in 1820-30, it's not an important issue. It's where the English will come from to help you defend Belgium against the French. Otherwise, it's not hugely important. By 1900, the leading writers on strategy and war are German. The War of 1870-71 has given German strategic writers the bragging rights. And people like Colmar von der Goltz, Friedrich Bernhardi, are putting forward views on war which are extreme and profoundly different to those of Clausewitz. And these ideas are appearing in London, in English. They're appearing in Paris in French as well. And they catch the zeitgeist. This is what war is going to be like. It's going to be total. It's going to be mass mobilization. It's going to be enormous armies, tremendous amounts of violence, and there will be a climactic battle, and the winners will destroy the losers. And Corbett is quite clear that this is not a war that Britain is going to be fighting. It's going to be fighting a very different war. And he reads the work of another German general, Rudolf von Kammerer, who stresses that the key thing with Clausewitz is you can develop this philosophy to meet different circumstances. Clausewitz is not writing about Imperial Germany. He's writing about a relatively weak Prussian state in the 1820s, which is fearful of being attacked by the French, possibly the Austrians, and maybe even the Russians. And when he puts the book away unfinished, he's going off to patrol the Prussian border against a Polish insurrection. These are troubling times. He's writing a war plan in case the French invade. By 1900, that is not the case. So this literature, which is coming across unfiltered from Germany, is being read in English editions, invariably published in red dust jackets to encourage soldiers to read it, put out by publishers right here on the Mall in London. And this is the dominant literature. And it's this literature which is shaping the way the British Army is anticipating fighting in the First World War. Despite being a tiny little force, they're dreaming of being a multi-million-man army. Corbett is contesting that, and that's what the battle strategy is all about. It's about preserving the way Britain operates strategically from an imported alien concept which doesn't work for the British. Clausewitz gives you all the material you need to develop your own strategy. But if you read von der Goltz, there is only one way to wage war, and that's with enormities. Von der Goltz is what we would now call a war criminal. In 1914, he's shooting people in Belgium because there's some resistance to German occupation, and he doesn't see that that's a problem. In the British tradition, that certainly would be a problem. So it's Corbett's ability to interpret the work of other strategists and to develop it into something which is the system for Britain, not just historically, but also going forward. And remember that this isn't Britain static, this is Britain progressive. Corbett is a progressive liberal. His view of empire, and he knows quite a lot about the empire because he's seen quite a lot of it, is that the empire will eventually develop into a commonwealth of nations, essentially freestanding, and that the unifying factor of the British Commonwealth will be maritime control, and that the navies of the dominions will be the unifying strategic factor in maintaining a British liberal progressive worldview. He is not in favor of turning the empire into a tariff union. He's in favor of free trade. So he's a progressive liberal civilian, unlike pretty much everybody else who writes about strategy in this period. So if you want to take one thing away about Corbett, it is that you get different sets of ideas from people who are coming into this debate from outside the military professions. They think differently. And it's no accident that his single most important collaborator in all of this, Admiral Lord Fisher, is also a radical, progressive liberal.
Thank you, Andrew. I'm struck by your comments, and he seems an incredibly prescient writer. He's talking about whole-of-nation warfare, which you might see represented in this idea of an age of competition that we're using to describe the world today. A move away from decisive battle, which, of course, isn't part of competition. It's very much a force-on-force concept. You've got integration of forces and integration with commerce, which is reflective of the UK's integrated operating concept that came out a couple of years ago. You're talking about lawfare, you're talking about coalitions, you're talking about unique national interest, national strategy. So why was he forgotten? Why did he fall out of favour?
The tragedy of Corbett is he wrote the official history of British grand strategy in the First World War, but he died before he finished it. This is a 5-volume project, and he died having finished the first 3 volumes. In the process of this, he exposed the failures and stupidities of some very powerful people. One of them is called Winston Churchill, who delayed the publication of Volume 1 for over a year in order to protect his political reputation from the fallout from his failures as First Lord of the Admiralty. And the second was Admiral Lord Beatty, who similarly protested about Volume 3 because it exposed his complete and utter tactical incompetence at the Battle of Jutland. Corbett won both of those battles because, being an astute lawyer, he made sure the government contract to publish the books was with a major London publishing house, and he wrote the contract to make it impossible for the government to stop publication. So the law is useful in many, many different ways. But these battles, and they were serious battles, and tracking this through his diary, you realize this is putting a huge strain on him. He's not in good health. He's well into his 60s and has a number of underlying health complaints. He literally drops dead having finished the Battle of Jutland, to his satisfaction. He doesn't get to write up the rest of the war. The official history of the First World War is dominated by vast numbers of red-bound volumes dealing with the tactical operations of the British Army on the Western Front. This is something Corbett abhorred. Narrow-minded, tactical, obsessive, dense narrative histories of insignificant activity. And he'd written very extensively about this before the war. This was the wrong model. He delegated this to people who could do it, and this was for tactical training purposes. It was not strategic at all. All the strategic decision-making is handled in the books known as naval operations. Corbett's death meant that the last two volumes were not finished to the standard that he would have completed them. There is no strategic analysis in volumes 4 and 5. They were finished by a poet rather than a historian or a strategist. He died in 1922, which is the year of the Washington Naval Conference, when Britain finally admitted that it wasn't absolutely dominant at sea and would share dominance with the Americans. And from that point on, we see a drifting away of the age of Britain as a dominant maritime actor. Naval power in itself is at discount in the interwar period. This is a period when naval armaments are severely limited, but land and air armaments are completely unrestricted, both in size and quantity. So we have, in 1939, the world goes to war with First World War navies and Second World War armies and air forces, and it takes some time to catch up. So the things that Corbett stood for, the importance of sea power, maritime power for the British, have been damaged, and it will take some time to recover from that in the Second World War. His work is promoted in the interwar period by his great friend Admiral Sir Herbert Richmond, who was the first director of the Imperial Defence College and set the tone for combined arms operations in the Second World War. But his name disappeared from the lists. His great book, Some Principles of Maritime Strategy, was published in 1911. It appeared again in 1919. A small edition in 1930, and it was not then republished until 1974. So the single most important book on what British strategy is not available. You can't buy a copy. You'd have to ferret one out from the library. And it's no accident that it was the professor at the Greenwich Naval College who republished it in 1974. He was my PhD supervisor as well, because he understood that the Navy had completely lost track of what British strategy actually was, because it wasn't being exposed to the work of a man who really had given his life to get this job done. So the synergy between where we are today and where Corbett was is not accidental. It's inevitable. For a period between 1945 and 1990, Britain had commitments on the European continent as part of the Cold War, and these were politically essential, although their strategic utility is open to question. And they dominated defense. So they meant that 2 generations of defense specialists were focused on the British Army on the Rhine, Air Force Germany, and that anything the Navy was doing was referred to as out of area, as in out of the NATO area, and not therefore very important. This started to change with the Falklands War 40 years ago, and obviously it changed more fundamentally later. But Britain is slowly but surely realizing that the short-term strategic requirements of a particular set of eventualities doesn't change the long-term realities. Britain is not a continental European power. That's a conscious choice. It was made by Henry VIII, and it led to the foundation of a very large Royal Navy. Henry built a navy so that he could stand aside from Europe, and he broke with the Catholic Church for exactly the same reason. It wasn't about getting rid of the Queen. It was about getting rid of the influence of major European organizations in England, the Catholic Church and the Holy Roman Empire. So what is Corbett doing? Ultimately, he's capturing and processing strategic experience over centuries. He's highlighting the case studies where it works really well. He's looking at case studies where it doesn't work well, the American War of Independence he refers to quite often, just to demonstrate that this doesn't work every time, and that there are circumstances in which British strategy isn't going to deliver the answers you want. But if it's well handled, and if you can find the leadership qualities that you need at the political and the strategic level, you can be very successful. The great battle of the First World War is Admiral Fisher's attempt to assert a maritime strategy against the continentalists. And Fisher comes to realize that there is nobody in the British cabinet who has the brains and the courage to do this. The only man who looks like he just might do this is Lloyd George. And it's interesting that Fisher is working with Lloyd George in 1915, in the point where he comes up to his resignation. And Corbett recognizes that with Fisher's resignation, the chances of a maritime strategy have disappeared. That battle has been lost. And there's a terrifying letter that Corbett writes to Fisher in 1918, just as the war reaches what looks like a very low point with the Michael offensive in March 1918. I don't know why I've spent all of my life doing this, because nobody's bothered to listen, and it looks like we're going to lose the war as well. And if only people had listened to what you were saying in 1914 and 15, we wouldn't be in this mess now. So getting your strategy right is about understanding how the past delivers a lot of information. It's about processing it, and it's about making sure people understand that every set of circumstances is going to be different. And you can't just pull it off the shelf and do it again. You've got to be able to bring those ideas into the context in which you're operating. There is no one size fits all. And copying other people's strategy, particularly that of Central European countries that think very much about short-range military operations, simply irrelevant. However clever these ideas are in their context, they don't work. You have to know what game you're playing before you start to think about the rules.
To sum up then your argument in The British Way of War, Julian Corbett and the Battle for a National Strategy, is that Corbett really brought together some very key elements of enduring importance to British strategic posture, and those are very, very crucially this interplay between Navy and Army, between a naval power that is just off the shores of Europe and its continental allies, and that is the essence of what Corbett was demonstrating through many historical examples in a very lasting way, in a very beautifully analytical way. Thank you very much, Professor Andrew Lambert, for talking to us today, and once again let me mention the book on the whole thing that will elaborate this in much greater detail, The British Way of War, Julian Corbett and the Battle for a National Strategy. Thank you very much.
Thank you for joining us. This has been a RUSI podcast in which we've been talking strategy. The podcast is available via the RUSI website at rusi.org and on all major platforms including Spotify and Apple Podcasts. To be notified about when future episodes are available, you can follow RUSI on social media. Thank you for listening, and Beatrice and I hope you can join us for our next conversation, where we'll be talking about three Prussian strategists from the late 19th and early 20th century, Colmar von der Goltz, Alfred von Schlieffen, and Friedrich von Bernhardi. We will be discussing these strategists with Dr. Stig Forster, Emeritus Professor at the Universität Bern, and we hope that you can join us for that conversation.